The wind on the plains had a way of speaking when no one else would. It pressed against the man's back like a hand, pushing him forward over the dry, broken trail that led from the ranch to the trading post 17 miles east. His name was Ellis McCree, a name said in the same breath as failure by the few neighbors who still spoke of him at all. A failed cattle run, a burned barn, 2 winters that took more stock than he could count. And now, boots worn through and pack near empty, he walked alone through a world that had long stopped giving. His horse had gone lame the month prior. Too old and too stubborn to pull a plow, she'd fallen in the mud and hadn't gotten back up. Ellis buried her without a word, same way he buried the last of his hopes of making it through another season without help. He walked now, and when he reached Granger's trading post with blood on his socks and frost-bitten fingers, he took no charity. He traded what little he had, dried beans, a chipped hunting knife, a length of braided rope for a sack of flour, 2 cans of lard, and a coil of wire for his broken fence. It wasn't enough. It never was. The townsfolk noticed him, but none offered more than a nod or a whispered comment. There had been talk of him once. That old ranch belonged to his pa, they'd said. Ran good steers out that way before the war. But Ellis had come back different, thinner and quieter, with too much emptiness in his eyes and not enough money in his pockets. What they didn't say, but all knew, was that Ellis had once sent for a bride, a mail-order arrangement. A woman from Massachusetts, plain of face but strong of will, if the letter was to be believed. Her name was June Mercer. She'd come as far as Denver, then sent a wire saying she'd changed her mind. Saw something in the people's eyes when they spoke of Ellis. She'd rather turn back than tie herself to a man half the land thought cursed. That was 5 years past. What they didn't know was that June Mercer had not gone back east. She had changed her name, taken a job cooking in a boarding house outside of Granger, and disappeared into the fabric of the frontier. She told herself it was safety, not cowardice, that kept her from returning. She'd seen enough sad men in her life to know not to marry one. Still, something had kept her close. She told herself it was because she liked the dryness of the wind, the quiet of the hills, but the truth was more tangled. She saw Ellis that day when he came to town. Saw the way he limped on his right leg, the old injury from the war that made walking 17 miles something that carved pain into a man's bones. She watched from behind the curtains of the boarding house kitchen as he refused help, as he carried his meager purchases with the stubbornness of a man still pretending he could make it alone. And she felt something stir that she had buried deep, a shame that he had been left, and a strange pull toward the life she had once agreed to share. That night, she left a loaf of bread on the edge of the path leading out of town. No note. No explanation, just bread still warm. She waited until dawn to see if it had been taken. It was gone. Ellis didn't question where it came from. He knew better than to question blessings. He ate it in silence beneath the stars, sitting on a stone by the edge of the trail, thinking of nothing and everything. The woman who'd left, the ranch falling apart, the fence he needed to mend, and the calf he'd found dead by the creek. June watched him from a distance for weeks after that. She didn't understand why. She made her choice. But something about the man, silent, proud, and slowly dying on his feet, refused to let her turn away. One evening after her shift, she walked the path toward the edge of the canyon near his land. She told herself it was for air, for solitude. But when she saw the collapsed portion of his fence, the carcass of a coyote shot and left for the buzzards, she knew she wasn't just wandering. Ellis was there, hammer in hand, driving wire through old posts like it was the only thing left keeping him upright. He looked up once, nodded, and went back to work. He didn't know who she was. Not yet. She didn't say a word. Not yet. And the wind, cold and rising from the distant mountains, carried a promise in its sound. Something was about to change. The first snow came late, falling in erratic flurries that stuck in the hollows and vanished by noon. The ground was thirsty and unwilling to hold onto anything soft. Ellis didn't care. He'd mended the fence with splintered hands, saved one calf from the last hard rain, and found half a bag of oats in the shed he'd forgotten. He cooked by lantern light and slept with his boots on, half waiting for the wind to carry some new disaster through the cracked walls of the house his father had built. It wasn't much of a house anymore. The west wall lined, the chimney smoked when it shouldn't, and the upstairs bedroom, once meant for a wife and children, had been locked since the day he realized none would come. He slept by the hearth now, under a pile of quilts and an old cavalry coat. But someone had been leaving things, not every day, not often enough to make it seem deliberate. A bar of lye soap wrapped in oilcloth, a jar of honey. A wool scarf, hand-stitched and plain, left on the gate hook without a note. Ellis didn't ask questions. He wasn't the kind of man who believed in fate, but he understood gratitude in silence. Whatever this was, a charity, a kindness, or something else, it kept him from feeling entirely erased. June told no one. She kept her secrets folded like linens in the bottom of a cedar chest. Each evening she passed the time sewing or scrubbing or darning something that didn't need darning. The boarding house was always full of noise: travelers, oilmen, widows headed west, preachers too young to have seen real blood. And yet none of them saw the way her eyes drifted past the window when the sun dipped behind the trees. One night, Mrs. Hargreaves, the woman who ran the boarding house with the temper of a Missouri mule, caught her staring into the dark. "You keep looking that way and you'll fall out of your own head," she said, handing June a kettle of boiled potatoes. "There's nothing out there but dust and regret." June took the kettle and said nothing. She remembered the letter Ellis had written, plain words, neat handwriting. He hadn't promised riches, just land, silence. A place to build something away from the crush of city noise. She said yes because she'd wanted that, wanted it bad enough to get on a train and leave her whole life behind. Then she'd arrived in Denver and heard the whispers, that he was a recluse, that he'd gone strange, that the land was no good and the man was worse. She'd run. But what if the mistake wasn't in answering the letter, but in running from it? She didn't sleep that night. Instead, she packed a small satchel before dawn: food. A fresh set of stockings. The scarf she'd knitted him in case he hadn't kept the first. She didn't write a note, just walked. 20 minutes past the edge of town, she heard the thunder of hooves. A wagon was coming fast from the south, wheels skimming the dry ground with a rattling clatter. She stepped aside, lifting her skirts out of the dust, but the wagon didn't pass. It stopped. The driver was an old man, cheeks weathered like dried apples, eyes sharp under a sweat-stained hat. "You headed out that way?" he asked, gesturing with his chin. "Depends which way you mean." "McCree's land. Only one fool out that far." She hesitated, then nodded. He gave a low whistle. "Can't say I'd recommend it. Heard he shot at a fella for steppin' too close to the fence." She climbed up without asking and sat beside him. "I don't scare easy," she said. He studied her for a moment, then snapped the reins. The horses pulled them into motion, dust rising like smoke behind them. It took an hour to reach the turnoff, then another half-mile of silence before the cabin came into view. Ellis was outside, shirt sleeves rolled, chopping wood. His movements were slow, deliberate, as though he was measuring the weight of each swing. The wagon pulled to a stop. He turned, axe still in hand, and froze. June stepped down. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The wind stirred the edge of her shawl. A crow called from the trees beyond the creek. Then quietly she said, "I brought butter and nails." He set the axe down. "You came late." She nodded. "But I came." Something cracked between them, not loud, not shattering, but like a seam opening in dry earth, letting in the first drink of rain. And then she stepped forward, toward the house she had once refused, not as a bride. Not yet, but as something harder, truer. A woman who'd made a mistake and come back to see if it could be unmade. The house smelled of cedar and old ash. June stepped through the threshold with her boots still on, trailing bits of gravel behind her. She stood in the low-slung doorway while Ellis cleared a place for her things, silent as ever, moving with the uneasy rhythm of a man unaccustomed to company. The hearth still held the ghost of last night's fire, and the kettle on the stove was warm, but the rest of the room bore no signs of life beyond survival. She unpacked without comment, set the butter on the shelf, the nails beside a rusted tin of screws, the bread in a dish she rinsed first in cold pump water. Ellis watched, but only with the side of his face, never fully turning. She moved through the space like someone cataloging ruin. After a long while, she asked, "Where do I sleep?" Ellis pointed to the cot near the window. "Bed upstairs ain't right for weather. Roof lakes there." She didn't ask if that was where he once meant for her to sleep. Didn't ask if he'd ever taken anyone else up there. She knew he hadn't. The nights came early in the flatlands and colder than she'd remembered. They didn't talk after supper. He took the rocker by the fire. She sat at the table with mending in her lap she didn't touch. When she rose to bank the fire, she found him already asleep, head tilted, breath slow. The scars on his knuckles caught the firelight. She remembered the rumors, the war, the ambush, the winter his brother died. All of it lived under his skin. The next morning, she woke before him. She cooked salt pork and coffee, left the food on the hearthstone, and went outside to the edge of the corral. 3 of the fence rails had come loose again, and one post leaned like a drunk. She fetched a hammer and started to fix it. He joined her later, boots crunching over frost. "You don't have to," he said. "I know." They worked without speaking. By midday, the sun had burned through the haze, and their hands were raw from cold and effort. She found herself watching him, not the way she had from the window in town, but more closely now. How he limped slightly more when tired, how he muttered to himself when the nail bent sideways. When she cut her hand on a wire, he took it without ceremony, wrapped it in a strip of clean flannel, then held it a moment longer than necessary. His touch wasn't gentle, but it wasn't careless either. That evening, she lit the oil lamp while he patched a boot by firelight. "I'll need to go to Granger soon," he said, "out of sugar and powder." "I'll come," she replied. He looked at her then fully, the first time since she arrived. "You don't owe me that. I owe myself the walk." The road into town had always felt like penance to Ellis. 17 miles of dry wind, rutted tracks, and silence that stretched like an accusation. But with her beside him, it changed. She didn't speak much, but her presence filled the spaces between the wind. She kept pace, unbothered by the dust or cold, and when they stopped to rest, she shared a hard biscuit without asking if he wanted it. They reached Granger just after noon. People stared. Ellis saw it. Saw the way heads turned, the way whispers gathered in corners like flies around old meat, but June didn't flinch. She walked beside him through the trading post, hand resting lightly on the side of her satchel, eyes forward. He noticed how straighter he stood with her there, how the clerk at Granger's didn't speak down to him this time. They traded for salt, sugar, 2 tins of oil, and a bolt of muslin. June added a spool of thread and a packet of seeds when he wasn't looking. Outside, he turned to her. "You were supposed to be my wife." She met his eyes. "You asked for a partner. I wasn't ready to be one. And now, I'm not here for saving. I came back to build." He didn't reply, just nodded once, but something in his jaw unclenched. The walk home was slower. They talked some weather, fence repairs, a coyote that had gotten into the coop. Small things, necessary things. But that night, after the fire had burned low, June reached for the latch of the upstairs door. He watched her, eyes shadowed. "You don't have to," he said again. She didn't answer, just climbed the stairs. The bedroom was colder than she'd expected. The roof had a leak she could hear, slow drops tapping into a rusted basin someone had left to catch them. Dust filmed the windows. The bed was bare save for a single thin quilt and a mattress that sagged in the middle, but it was dry, and it was hers now. June didn't light a lamp. She lay there in her clothes, boots by the side, hand curled beneath her chin like she used to as a girl. In the dark, memories stirred, the scent of oil soap, the sound of church bells on winter mornings, her father's voice telling her there were two kinds of women in the world. The ones who stayed soft and the ones who didn't. She was not soft anymore. In the morning she rose before light, stripped the bedding, swept the floor, and patched the crack in the window with waxed linen. She boiled water and scrubbed the basin clean, then mended the old quilt with the muslin she'd bought. When Ellis came up later, looking for a pipe he'd left long ago, he found the room warm, clean, and unmistakably changed. She didn't explain it, and he didn't question it. The days folded into rhythm. They worked the land side by side, building with what they had, repairing what they couldn't replace. The weather held steady for a while, long enough to get seed into the ground, long enough to cut firewood without snow creeping under their collars. In town, people talked more, asked fewer questions. When Ellis came in now, June often stayed behind, but folks knew she was there. Word traveled, as it always did, and softened with the telling. Mrs. Hargreaves sent a parcel, spools of thread, a jar of peach preserves, and a note that said only, "You're braver than I thought." June hung the note by the window. They did not call each other husband and wife, not yet, but they shared meals, shared burdens, shared silence in a way that meant more than words. He let her lead the planting, listened when she spoke of what the soil needed. She let him teach her how to fire the old rifle, though she hated the recoil and the sound. One night in late spring, a dust storm came down from the north. The sky turned the color of old bruises, and wind tore across the land like a living thing. Ellis had tied the barn doors shut earlier, stabled the horse, pulled water into barrels. June nailed the shutters, then sat beside him on the floor while the world roared. The storm lasted until near dawn. When it passed, it left silence sharp as glass. They went out together, surveyed the damage. Part of the fence was gone. The henhouse had collapsed, but the house stood and the crops held. Ellis wiped the sweat from his brow, looked at her across the ruined coop. "You ever think about leaving again?" "No," she said. "You." He shook his head. They worked all day repairing the fence. Toward dusk, they heard hooves, fast, wrong somehow. Ellis stepped into the house and came back with the rifle. The rider came into view. A boy, 17, maybe 18, thin and dust-covered, barely holding to the saddle. The horse pulled up hard, lathered and wide-eyed. "Help," the boy rasped. "They're common," took my pa's land, shot him, burned it down. Ellis lowered the rifle. "Who?" The boy coughed blood. "4 men. One had a red coat, said no law out here, said they'd come back through the ridge." June moved to catch him before he fell. They laid him in the barn, stitched what they could, but the bleeding wouldn't stop. He died that night. Ellis buried him by the creek the next morning, his hands shaking as he tamped the earth flat. "They'll be close by now," he said when he came in, wiping blood and dirt from his fingers. June sat at the table, the rifle across her lap. "Then we prepare." She didn't ask if he would run, and he didn't tell her to hide. Outside, the wind shifted, and somewhere beyond the ridge, trouble moved. The ground held no softness that morning. June stepped out before dawn, frost coating the edges of the trough, sky hanging in that dead hour before light. The grave by the creek had frozen over, a pale crust of earth sealing the boy beneath. She stood beside it for a long while, not praying, not mourning, just memorizing the shape of another loss. Inside, Ellis packed ammunition into an old tobacco tin. He checked the rifle twice, cleaned the revolver he hadn't used since the war, laid both out on the table like relics. June returned without a word and poured water into the kettle. They waited for the boil, neither speaking, until the wind changed. "They'll come through the saddle pass," Ellis said, not looking up. "Same way every man with ill intent comes, thinking the world don't watch what it don't care to own." June nodded. "We need high ground." They scouted the ridge together. A narrow switchback wound through dead pines and stone outcroppings, good sight lines, cover, and an overlook above the trail the boy had described. June marked the trees with small chalk slashes, the same way she used to mark seams for mending. Ellis dug a shallow foxhole behind a boulder and stashed the rifle there beneath oilcloth. They worked without rush, without panic. Violence, they both knew, was patient. It waited for the unready. By nightfall, the traps were set, wire strung between low branches, nails buried in mud outside the eastern fence, a kettle rigged with shot and twine near the back window. Improvised defenses, but better than none. When the sky turned black, they sat inside with lamps out, backs to the wall. June held a blade in her lap. Ellis cradled the revolver. "You've killed before," she said. He nodded. "You." "No, but I don't flinch." He looked at her, really looked, and saw not the woman from the letter, not the girl who ran, but the one who stayed. The one who came back ready to shoulder his ruin. "If we survive this," he said, "you and me." She held his gaze. "We already began." The first shot came before dawn, a single crack far off testing. A signal. Ellis moved to the door, rifle in hand. June slid behind the windowsill, blade ready. They waited. Then came the second shot, closer, sharper. Ellis slipped out the back, took the long way up the ridge. June stayed low, eyes on the tree line. Her breath came slow, measured. She heard movement, hooves, then boots, voices, 4 of them, just as the boy said. "House is empty," one called. "Lights out, maybe they ran." "No tracks say otherwise," another answered. "They're still here. McCree don't leave what's his." June shifted her grip. The trap by the side window snapped a moment later, an explosion of metal and wood. A scream followed. "Son of a bitch, my leg." Another voice barked orders. "Fan out." "Find them." June didn't hesitate. She smashed the lantern base, the flash of fire drawing one man toward the door. When he burst through, she stepped from the side, blade up, and drove it under his arm. He staggered, clawing at her, but she twisted the knife free and let him fall. Blood soaked the floor. On the ridge, Ellis took down another with a clean shot to the chest. The man rolled downhill, landing near the water trough, limbs jerking once before going still. The third rushed the barn, kicking the door open. June was already there. She slammed the pitchfork through his thigh, then cracked the butt of the rifle across his skull. He dropped, groaning. The last man, a red coat, scar across his chin, came up fast behind the house, too fast for stealth. Ellis saw him too late. They grappled in the dirt, fists and knees, teeth bared like animals. The red coat was younger, faster. He got a hand around Ellis's throat. June appeared behind him, silent as winter. She didn't speak, just pressed the revolver to his spine and pulled the trigger. He dropped like butchered meat. For a moment, all was still. Ellis coughed, spat blood, and sat back in the dirt. She crouched beside him, breathing hard, gun still warm in her grip. "You all right?" she asked. He nodded once. "You." "I don't flinch," she said again. They stood over the bodies as the light returned, the morning creeping in slow. The boy's blood hadn't dried yet, neither had theirs, but they were standing, and that meant something. They buried the men in a line behind the hill, far from the creek, far from the grave that mattered. No markers, no words, just dirt and weight and silence. June washed the blood from her hands in the trough, scrubbed until her skin went raw. Ellis burned the red coat in the fire pit and left the ashes to scatter with the wind. The law didn't come. It never did. Granger heard whispers, sure, that McCree had trouble ride in, that something foul passed through the canyon, left a trail of blood. But no one rode out to verify. They knew what kind of justice lived that far west, the kind carved by hand, not written on paper. In the days that followed, the land settled like lungs exhaling. The chickens began to lay again. The frost broke, the earth softened. Ellis limped more than usual but didn't complain. June redug the garden rows with her sleeves rolled, dirt under her nails, hair bound with twine. Neither spoke much of the fight. There was no retelling, no glory pulled from it, just the work that followed and the quiet they shared. But some things changed, too clear to name. She slept upstairs now with the door open. He built a new bed frame, sanded it smooth, set it near the window so morning would find them early. When the wind blew in off the ridge, it passed through glass he'd repaired himself. One afternoon she found a letter folded in the old ledger where he kept crop accounts. Her name written across the front in small, steady script. Inside, "You were never a mistake, only the timing was." She didn't answer in ink. She answered in days, by staying, by waking early, by feeding the stock, by taking his coat in from the line before rain. She answered in the long pauses they didn't rush to fill, in the meals she cooked and the evenings they sat watching the tree line, her hand resting just close enough. Spring pushed its way up through the thaw, crops broke soil, the fence held, the well ran clear. One morning she brought out a tin of seed she hadn't shown him yet, heirloom beans bright as marbles. "We plant these near the house," she said. He studied her, near the window, where we can see them grow. He nodded. That night he brought out the envelope, the one he'd kept in the bottom drawer since the day her telegram came, the one saying she wouldn't be coming. He burned it in the stove, watched it curl to nothing, then went to her, quiet as always, and placed a hand on her shoulder. They stood like that for a long while, not as strangers, not as regret, but as the only two left who had bled for this land, and bled for each other, and still remained. When summer came, the fields bent green and gold beneath the weight of sky. The porch creaked with new nails. The barn stood whole. And when neighbors passed by, and some did now, they spoke with less pity, more pause. "McCree's land's common back," they'd say, and another would nod, eyes narrowing toward the house. "No, he didn't do it alone." They never asked the woman's name. Didn't need to. She was the one who saw his worth when there was nothing left to see, and stayed to build something from it. The sixth summer brought storms, not the kind that tore shingles or stripped the orchard bare, though those came too, but the quiet ones, the slow griefs that settle behind the ribs. The price of survival, June had learned, wasn't just blood, it was memory. It was learning to live past the fire without becoming ash yourself. The land had grown, fields fuller, fences whole, cattle fat. They'd even hired a boy from Granger to help with the heavier work. He called her ma'am and Ellis sir, and fed the hens without being told twice. They never asked his story. He had one. Everyone out here did. But things settled the way scars do. Uneven but strong. Ellis laughed more now, not often, not loud. But it came, a breath behind a joke, a dry murmur when she chased the pig out of the kitchen with a broom. He carved her a comb from juniper wood one winter, left it by the basin without a word. She kissed his shoulder that night, gentle as new cloth. They had no children. The war had taken something from him he didn't speak of, and she'd long passed the time for hoping. But that house held something more sacred than heirs. It held choice. One evening, as summer bled into fall, she sat on the porch steps, shawl across her knees. The air smelled of smoke and ripe grain. She could hear Ellis in the barn, muttering as he worked the lantern. A rider came up the trail, not fast, not armed, just a woman in a faded blue coat leading a mule behind her. Face like worn parchment, eyes sharp. "You June Mercer?" the woman asked. June stood. "I was." The woman nodded. "Heard about what happened out here. Heard you didn't run." I didn't. The woman looked toward the barn. There's others, she said, like you. Women who left or got left or were told they weren't enough. We're macking something, a place for them, a network, I guess, word of mouth, safe houses, lessons, trade routes. And you want me? No. I want women to know what they can become. June looked past her, to the field she'd coaxed into bloom with her own hands, to the fence she'd rebuilt, to the man inside that barn, sanding down a door he'd carved from trees they'd planted together. She stepped forward, took the woman's hand, pressed something into it. Then take this, June said. A seed from my garden, beans, hardy, can grow in bitter ground. The woman tucked it into her coat and left without another word. Inside, Ellis was waiting. She gone? He asked. She was never here for me, June said. She came for the one still running. He nodded. That night, they sat in the upstairs room, the same one she'd once refused. The sky outside held no moon, just stars that blinked like old eyes. June placed a map on the table, drew a line from Granger to the next town and the next, marked a small cross beside each. Safe stops, she said. Places we know, names we trust. Ellis placed his hand over hers. You think they'll come? They already are. Years later, long after their names stopped being spoken in town, long after their bones were dust in the canyon, people still passed through the ranch. Women mostly, some young, some hollow-eyed, all carrying something heavy. They didn't knock. They just walked the ridge trail, paused by the creek, and found what had been left for them: notes in jars, maps in floorboards, seeds folded into handkerchiefs. And in the soil, still wild with beans and sage, the memory of a woman who came back not for forgiveness, not for love, but for justice, and found all three.